Book of the day is an unusual science fiction book in a few different ways, I think. Mockingbird by Walter Tevis. Now, how I came across this book is a very non-science fiction way of coming across a book. In my childhood and early teens, I lived in a non-English speaking country. There wasn't a lot of access to books, but there was a gift shop that was near us. In that gift shop was one of those wire racks that everyone from the 70s and 80s remembers. You had books, paperbacks stacked 2 or 3 deep. It rotated. The books slowly got napped from too much handling and sitting on the wire, and then the covers started curling. I'm sure lots of us remember them. Now, because this gift shop didn't actually order books separately, it just accepted whatever was sent, and that was normally things like Agatha Christie, James Hadley Chase, a lot of amazing bestsellers that no one could remember 2 days later, and certainly not many years later. And then, to my stunned delight, when I was about 11, I came across this, which is unmistakably science fiction. But it's an unusual sort of science fiction. Many sci-fi books, you pick them up, you open them up, you instantly realize that you're reading a science fiction, whether that's a modern one like Altered Carbon, it feels science fiction. If it's an old one, Strange Land, you're not going to find many pages that don't feel like you're reading science fiction. The overall writing style and feeling of Mockingbird is not science fiction. It feels like you're reading regular fiction, but it is 100% sci-fi. So Walter Tevis was an American novelist. He wrote short stories, a few novels. He wasn't primarily a sci-fi writer. He seems to mostly have liked gambling and money type mainstream fiction. He did write The Man Who Fell to Earth, which got turned into a sci-fi movie, which I don't believe I've seen. And he also wrote The Queen's Gambit, which I think recently a streaming service picked up and turned into a series. It might have been Netflix. Anyway, Mockingbird is really unusual. It starts in New York City somewhere in the future, but it is somewhere so far in the future that it's unrecognizable, and we have no landmarks. We start off with 3 main characters. One is Robert Spofforth. I can't pronounce this thing. Spofforth. Spofforth. Who thought that was a name that you give a character in a book, for goodness sake? Well, this particular character is a robot. He's a Make 9 robot, which is the most complex robot that was ever made by mankind. And the Make 9s were developed to accept a recording of a brain of a real person. But that brain has been edited, so the Make 9 robots, all of whom received the same brain, never knew who the person was, and most of his character and his personal experiences were wiped out. A few remnants remained. The future that Robert Mark 9 robot starts with is a New York in which people are all drugged zombies, basically walking around. The city is maintained only by robots. The sociological development has been that all people should explore self-development, not interact with other people, mandatory privacy rules, and everything is manifestly falling apart. It's post-dystopian with no dystopian ever actually given. So most post-dystopian books, most post-Holocaust or dystopian books, what you get is an explanation for how it happened. But here all you get is non-explanations for how it happened. So yes, so we've got the robot. He every spring, I think it is, or is it autumn, he goes to the top of the Empire State Building and tries to commit suicide. He's been trying for a couple of 100 years. As long as he's been alive, he can't suicide. He's been programmed not to. Then our next introduction character, who is our main protagonist, arguably, is Paul Bennett. No. Oh, this is annoying. He's the main voice for all of them. For almost the whole story. Bentley, there we go. Paul Bentley. Paul Bentley is an academic lecturer at the University of Ohio, and he rings up Spofforth, who runs the New York University, having discovered a new skill which was probably once prevalent but which no one has even heard of. No one knows what a book is, and no one knows how to read. Can you see what a hook that is for someone like me? So Bentley discovered a small iron box in the basement in which there were 3 early reader books. Roberto and Consella and their dog Biff was one, and he eventually has taught himself to read. Spofford brings him to New York to do a summer course. He explains that reading cannot be taught in a university, though he sneakily doesn't describe why. But he says that there's these silent films in the basement. In order for someone to know what the films are about, they have to be read. So Bentley gets a job doing that, and as most of this is taught, is spoken through his voice, you start early on, and that's partly what gives this an unusual feel. He's got a very measured, deliberate manner of speaking. At no point does he ever really feel like he lapses into jargon, if there is even any jargon, because this society is messed up. He lives in the basement. He eats the soy bars that the robots bring him. He practices privacy. And he takes all the thousands and thousands of pills that people seem to rely on. Pills to sleep, pills to feel good, pills to feel bad. You find out that you can buy in corner stores this mixed pack of pills of all the different colours that mean different things. Greens and yellows and blues and whatever. It's a wild world that he's described, and he describes it very well, and there's a slow reveal. There's no dates, there's no places. There's no explanation of where humanity has come from to be here, and that's consistent because your voice is Paul Bentley, and Paul Bentley has no history. History is no longer taught or even acknowledged as real. Reading hasn't been taught in schools for probably a couple of hundred of years, we estimate. The people live in a drugged haze. Now, on one occasion, Paul Bentley goes for a walk to the zoo. And in the zoo, he encounters our other protagonist, Mary Lou Bourne, who is living in the reptile house. She's dropped out. Now, in this society, dropping out means officially dropping out, going to live on a reservation where they give you heaps of drugs and pills. And Mary Bentley had tried that, only the drugs and pills made her feel sick, so she stopped smoking the supplied dope, and she stopped taking the supplied sopors, as they call them. Only instead of dropping back in, she just walked until she got somewhere. She is totally revolutionary character to Bentley because she will talk to him and answer when he talks to her, which is against all privacy rules, unless you're planning on having sex, because fast sex is the rule of the day. They start talking. Eventually he takes her back to the university. He teaches her to read. They find another book called The Dictionary, and it contains, as Paul Bentley says, a forest of words. And eventually they're separated. Now, I suppose at this point, if you're going to be worried about spoilers, this is the spoiler warning, because a lot of what I say is spoilers. I'm not sure how you can spoil a book that was published in 1980, maybe. But like I said, almost no one that I've ever met has read this. I'm not sure I've ever spoken to a single other person, sci-fi reader or other, who has read this. Goodreads, it's been shelved, but I don't think I could see more than 3 or 4 other reviews that mainly concentrated on how dated it is. It was written in 1980, of course it's dated. It's dated, but not badly, because this is so far in the future. Much like Jack Vance does, it's positioned so far in the future that it's irrelevant how far from now it is. Right, so Paul Bentley and Mary Lou have set up house together. They are learning to read. They have become lovers, which is also apparently a crime. Living together with someone for more than a certain number of days is a crime. And that's when Robert Spofford invades the basement and takes Paul off in front of a judge charged with reading, which is around about the level of mass murder or utter treason. in that society. Not that he knew, because no one knows what the word means. And Bob Spofforth certainly hadn't warned him. And for cohabiting, because they'd cohabited for a long time. So Paul Bentley, who was a mild-mannered academic who'd never rebelled for a single day in his life until he started reading, is hauled off to prison. Now, at this stage, both he and Mary Lou hadn't been using any drugs for a long time. They'd been enjoying being alive and aware and in the moment. Prison was a shock for him. He wasn't trained to work, but he does eventually escape, and he escapes in a poor time of year through winter, and he starts traveling up the seashore towards where he thinks New York is, surviving based on 2 books, one of which is Shore Dinners, Let's Have a Party, which teaches him how to get clams. And that's about his level of knowledge of anything ecological. The description of the world he travels through is fascinating because it's deserted. It's a world in which humans have vanished almost utterly. And in the meantime, from what we're learning from Mary Lou and back in New York, we're learning that humans are vanishing. The population is shrinking dramatically. And we find out over time that the reason it's shrinking is because there are anti-fertility drugs being put in all the sopors and the uppers and the downers and the marijuana that everyone on earth takes. And that becomes increasingly sinister as the novel progresses, because back in New York, since she and Paul had not been using drugs, Mary Lou discovers that she's pregnant, and they had slowly come to realize over time that they haven't seen any children. No one has ever seen a pregnant woman as far as they can remember. Mary Lou herself thinks she's probably about 30 years old, and she's never seen anyone younger than herself. So the human race is dying out thanks to these drugs. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, not worth debating in this scenario. From their point of view, their only world is themselves. And that's why I don't think this book is dated terribly badly, because these individuals live in a tiny bubble. They don't even count in days and months and years anymore. They count in colours. They've got no capacity to do things that of the most basic nature from an educated person's point of view. So that gives a childlike, not childish at all, but childlike attitude to anything that Paul does, whereas Mary Lou's a bit more of a rebel. And she's pregnant in New York, living in a unit with the robot Spofforth. He has got some vague memories that date back to the man whose brain he inherited, and he has thought that living with a woman might let them come to the fore. By the way, of all the Mark 9s that were made and impregnated with this one brain, all of them have committed suicide except for him. And that has to make you wonder about the engineers who used this one recording of a human brain. It's like, who told them to use an emo, mopey, suicidal brain? No matter how brilliant it was, that can't have been worth it. That was poor decision making in action, human beings. Poor decision making. And from here on, we have Mary Lou's story in New York, but there's not a lot of that. It's mostly Paul Bentley. He travels through the countryside. He encounters a town which has, again, a shrinking population of 7 families, each of which is heavily Christian, but it's a weird type of Christian. It's the sort of Christian where no one's been able to read the Bible for hundreds of years. And what they live off is a shelter. Now, I don't know America and its history well enough to know how true this is. It's a mall that has been developed against radiation. It's a safety shelter and mall with emergency quarters capacity, irradiated food, all the things. And it's called Maugre, Maugre. I don't know if that's significant to an American or if it's just an invented name. But these Christian families have grown up around there, feeding off this mall basically, though they've got agriculture. They consider privacy a sin. they pray to a god, but none of them can read. So when Paul Bentley turns up and is able to read the Bible, they take him in. Through these different perspectives, Paul's, Mary Lou's, Bofforth's, New York, Paul in prison and then travelling up the coast towards New York, you get this amazingly nuanced and very, very complex image of this future world and its decline. One thing I never noticed, I probably was a bit young to read this at 11, which is about when I think I first read it. I never noticed all the Christian motifs in it. And it's sort of Christian yet anti-Christian, because Paul Bentley has just decided very early on, having read the Bible, that he doesn't think that a God is very likely, and none of it makes much sense to him, which is consistent. But at the same time, the author, Tevis, keeps using symbology. So just before Mary Lou comes back to cohabit with him in the university, she's living in the reptile house and the zoo, and she gets in a temper with him because she thought he was different, but now just behaving like a normal human being. She doesn't believe that robots will be detected. She doesn't believe in laws. She thinks she can do whatever she likes. She goes outside. She picks up a rock. She throws it at the display of the python. And the two of them had had this interaction, wondering whether all the animals in the zoo were actually robots, because they're surrounded by robots on every side, and the animals aren't behaving like Paul thinks they should. The python is constantly in motion, never rests. There's a small group of creepy children robot that aren't marked as robots, but they're the only children they've ever seen. And when they're told to go away, robot go away, they go away. So it's this very, very creepy, insidious type society that's being created there. Anyway, Mary Lou gets annoyed with Paul. She throws a rock at the case. She grabs the python out and she's standing there with this python winding around her. A robot comes to tell her she's under arrest. She tells it to go away and gives it the python. And then she reaches into the cage and picks this plastic fruit, possibly a mango, and gives it to Paul. So 11-year-old me got no symbology out of that. But how symbolic is it? Adam, Eve, apple, snake. And it's used in a pretty twisted way. It doesn't actually follow the Christian mythology or the Judeo-Christian mythology in any way that I can see, but it makes it kind of harsh and bitter sequence at the same time. And then at the end, of course, you've got Mary Lou and Paul, who've got the first child that's been born on Earth. It's a girl, by the way, just in case you were wondering. And finally, Mary Lou made a deal, and one wonders if it's a kind of a devil's deal with Spofforth. He is the person, the individual, who has continued introducing anti-fertility drugs to all the human population on Earth, because he believes that since he was created to serve humans, as long as there's a human alive, he can't suicide, but maybe when there's no humans left, he can. And so his goal is to eradicate humanity, not because he cares about humanity much one way or another, but because he wants to die and he doesn't see any other way of doing it. So Mary Lou makes a deal that after she's had her baby, knows how to take care of the baby, and he takes the instructions away to make the entire population of the world unable to have children, then she's willing to push him off the Empire State Building and give him the death he desires. So there's a lot of symbology there. There's a lot more symbology when Paul Bentley meets the Morga tribes and asks to be baptized, and that gets him out being burnt in the nuclear furnace. There's a lot of interesting stuff along the way. In the end, they do push Spofforth off the building and he falls. And just before they do that, they're waiting for the dawn and he's standing there mobile, and a little sparrow comes and sits on his arm. And that's symbolic to me. I don't know if Blade Runner had come out. I think it did come out around about 1980, but I got strong Blade Runner symbology from that last bit with Spofforth and the sparrow. Just like the bit where Roy's about to die, is dying on the building. Anyway, that's an aside. And that's a movie, so that doesn't count, right? I think this book is beautifully written. the actual literature element to it is really good. It conforms to the sort of populist mainstream novel style writing of the times, but it's very well done. If you look at a lot of modern popular writing, it often isn't. It often relies on the story. The story here is magnificent, but sentence by sentence, it builds the story and you enjoy the actual writing. So, if you're looking for an 80s sci fi, if you're looking for a sci fi that not too many people will have read and has got some of the best. It's not even post-apocalyptic. There was never an apocalypse. Humans just sort of slowly started dying out. If you want a truly amazing future scenario that is chilling, I do recommend Mockingbird. I'd be fascinated to hear what you thought about it if you have read it, because you and I are probably among the half a dozen in the world.